Hello, I'm Pastor Daniel Dockery. If you're accustomed to joining us each week for this television broadcast ministry, you will notice that this is not the setting we typically use to introduce the message. As a matter of fact, I've invited you to join me on my front porch where I typically prepare sermons. As I give my heart and mind to God's Word, I love the multi-sensory experience of birds singing, the sun shines, the rain falls sometimes, neighbors drive by and wave. Every now and then the lightning even electrifies the sky. And my family lives right behind me, day in and day out. Over the next few months, we're going to be looking into Paul's words to the church in Rome. Some people think that the book of Romans is high theological art, but it's not to be relegated to the academy or to the spiritual elite. Paul's words in Romans were written to everyday Christians living their everyday lives. So my prayer is that God will take the riches of his kindness and grace and increase them daily as you spend time with us week by week in God's Word. I'm so grateful that you choose to join us, and I pray God will bless you richly.
Well, we've sort of been following along. Paul's arguments in Romans are very nuanced. They're very challenging to dissect. We try to be as straightforward as we can, but because this is theology, I've been working with teaching you some new words you might not use every day. And sort of the outline for this week, the theological frame is soteriology. That means the study of salvation. What does it mean to be saved? We use that word a lot, salvation, in the church, but what does that mean? And Paul is helping them understand what that means because we get it all mixed up sometimes. And we are so easily led astray. And so there's your new theological word for this week, soteriology. Use it. See if you can find a chance to use that in your everyday conversation this week. Just wherever it is, somebody that you know, just throw the word soteriology in there and see if they ask you any questions. And the original issue was the spiritual pride that Paul was working on. He is still working on it. This idea that the Jews had that they were superior spiritually to other people. Not just other people, all other people. They had spiritual superiority. And so he's working on that. The central truth is the agent of salvation is the Spirit, and the sign of salvation is a surrendered heart. See, the Jews thought the agent of salvation was the law, and the sign of salvation was obeying the law. But they were mistaken. So what is the issue for today? Well, we still have this issue of spiritual arrogance. And it's hard for me to stand here and say that because probably spiritual arrogance lives, if anywhere, most prominently in the pulpits, in the seminaries. And so I guess I'm speaking more to preachers than I am to you. But the issue really is true to this day. We still sometimes think we have a corner market on truth and that we've got it all figured out and we've got the right way. And that if people don't conform to that, then we're just not happy with them or they're not right. And we're not very open to conversation about things that sometimes we just don't know. They're the essentials of the faith. There's no doubt about that. But we have this idea that our way of doing things is the right way. And so there's still this spiritual arrogance. It also personally shows up in us when how we respond and act towards people outside. I told you last week about the survey that I read from Barna and was really shocked, and Johnny and I were talking about this past week. What hit me the most were the 5 questions that they asked. They asked 10 questions total. 5 of them had to do with things that Jesus did in the Bible, and 5 of them had to do with 5 attitudes that Jesus had. And remember, they asked Christians, do you do these things that Jesus did? And do you have these attitudes that Jesus had? So these are self-professed Christians. But what hit me was the questions. They took them right out of the Bible. And I said to Johnny, to be honest with you, when I read some of those questions, I had to say, no, I don't do that. I don't do some of the things Jesus did. I don't think some of the ways Jesus thought. I'm the pastor. It's hard to look inside and to ask ourselves personally, am I really a Christian? I'm not saying being saved, being right before God. I mean, am I pursuing the things of Christ and seeking to live like Him? Or am I fooling myself that I've got it all worked out spiritually and just sort of playing at religion? And so we still have this issue of spiritual arrogance before the Lord. And so the living truth for today is not to be a hypocrite. Let's just resolve in our heart that we will not be hypocrites. We will be honest and true and faithful, not outwardly as much as inwardly. So let's look back at, well, before we do, I want to talk about this word salvation. That's a good church word that we don't use much anywhere where else but in the church. But I want you to remember what salvation is. Salvation is what God has done, God's work that delivers us from sin and makes us right with Him. See, salvation was the key issue. The Jews thought salvation is what I have done to put myself right with God. But salvation is what God has done that delivers us from sin and makes us right with Him. And sometimes even in today's church, we forget that. We think that, oh, I did this, or I prayed this prayer, or I went to this church, or I obey these rules, or I'm in good fellowship with certain people, or whatever, or I follow this pastor, or I follow this teaching, that makes us right with God. The reality is salvation is God's work. It's what He has done for us. And there's no arrogance in coming to Him when you come to Him for salvation. There's only humility and surrender. And so that's what Paul's been dealing with, the whole issue of salvation. And the people in Rome were struggling with really what it meant to be saved, to have salvation, and how that happened. So over the last few weeks, this is where we've been. We're sort of continuing on. It's one long story. The truth is, and remember Paul does this consistently through the book of Romans, he compares and he contrasts, and he spends a lot of time doing that. The truth from Romans chapter 1, God reveals His power and nature to us. We rebel against that revelation. It does not take a rocket scientist to figure that out. You go to any culture, anywhere, you will find sin. You go to any kind of governmental structure, you will find sin. And you are fooling yourselves, and as a nation we're fooling ourselves if we think democracy is going to fix this world. We think that sometimes. If we just set up democratic governments, it's going to fix everything. And we discover that in democracy, people sin. There's no church structure. There's no governmental structure. There's nothing that takes care of the issue of sin except the cross of Jesus Christ. So we rebel against His revelation to us. He's revealed all of His goodness, all of His grandeur, all of the marvel of who He is, even just in what we see in nature. He's revealed all that. And yet we rebel against it. I thought about this over the past few weeks as I've been thinking about this message. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? I mean, if you're here this morning and you would like to take back some of the dumb, rebellious things you've done, will you raise your hand? Why do we do that? Why do we do things that we know are wrong? Why do we push against authority? Why do we break the laws? Why do we try to get away with not paying our taxes? Why do we do that stuff? Well, it's because we have this nature of rebellion within us. And so God, if we follow through with that rebellion, God releases us to follow our own desires. He says, I will not force you to obey me. He releases us to follow our own desires, and we begin to spiral downward. We progressively plunge into darkness. We see our nation right there, right now, progressively plunging into darkness. And that which is contrary to truth is highlighted as the truth in our culture and celebrated. And it is contrary to the teaching of God. Then last week we talked about God judges us based on the truth. Hey friends, He sees our hearts. You and I cannot hide from Him. We can hide from each other, and we can even hide from ourselves sometimes. But God judges us based on the truth of what He has talked about in His Word and the truth of what is real in our lives. We judge ourselves too highly. Have you noticed that? We think we're a little further along than we really are. We judge ourselves too highly. Therefore, last week we talked about when we judge ourselves too highly, we usually judge other people too lowly. And we assume we know more than we really know. God holds us, though, to his righteous standard. He does not grade us on the curve. He doesn't say, well, most people are this good, so I'm going to let everybody get away with that. He still judges us based on his righteousness and his standard. And yet, like the Jews, sometimes we think we're special before God. We think we have a special inroad. We think we know somebody or something that's going to get us out of really following through with God's plan of salvation. And so it brings us to this week. The first truth that we cannot make ourselves right with God. We can't. Paul, if you and I were there listening to Paul, let's just pretend for a few minutes we're this really devout Jew. And Paul's preaching this like a message. We would be a little addled because Paul does something throughout the book of Romans. He sort of pulls us along and says, okay, listen to this. And we think, yeah, you're right, Paul. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, Paul. Yeah, that's where we are. Go get him, Paul. And then boom, he lowers the hammer. And we're like, wait a minute, Paul, that's not right. Well, that hurts. So that's what he's been doing. They thought they could make themselves right before God. Listen, he says, now if you call yourself a Jew, now he's using this word Jew because the Jews in their mind were the only people that were right before God. And to be a Jew was to be right with God. That's what they thought. And so he says, if you're a Jew and if you rely on the law, and they're thinking, yeah, rely on the law. That's good, Paul. And you brag about your relationship to God, and they were not afraid to brag about their relationship. Yes, everything with God means great, Paul. That's right. Yes, I'm with you. And if you know his will, I know the will of God. Yeah, keep going, Paul. And you approve of what is superior because you're instructed by the law. Yeah, Paul, that's me. I got it. Yeah, I know what's in the law, and I'm instructed by the law. You got me. I'm good, Paul. And if you're convinced, actually the word there is if you have convinced yourselves, Paul begins to let them in a little bit on his secret. If you have convinced yourselves that you're a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have the law, the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You're like, oh yeah, that's me, Paul. God put me here to teach them. All those dumb people out there, all those ignorant people, all those people living in darkness, I'm here to teach them. And sometimes we have to be real careful because we do have the truth and we do have the light. But I have noticed something, especially in doing mission work, sometimes we can get this arrogance about us. And a lot of times when I go on the mission field, I discover they know more about God than I do. And they're serving God in ways that I never dreamed of. They're more surrendered than I ever thought about being. And yet, for some reason, we think we go there to teach them. We go there to help them. We are the great benefactor. And so the Jew so far is like, yes, you got me, Paul. That's right. God put me here for these people, these lowly, stupid people. They need me. They need light, and I have the light. And then Paul lets them have it. He says, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God? That's one of the key things. See, they were interested in honoring themselves. That's why we brag about our spiritual life. And you have to be real careful, my friends, because we can do it in such subtle ways. We can brag about our spiritual life. Such subtle ways to communicate that, I've got something figured out that you might have figured out. There's no place for spiritual arrogance anywhere. One of my favorite stories, I know I've told it to you before, but I can't help but think about it. There's a story about Chuck Swindoll when he was traveling with another pastor. They were preaching at a conference, and he said, this guy was just arrogant. Chuck Swindoll said, he was just arrogant. He said, we were staying in the same hotel. He said, I really seriously considered calling the front desk and having a beer delivered to his room. He said, I think that would have brought him down a few notches if the hotel thought he drank beer because he was just gushing with arrogance. We have to be careful because really what's important is God honored. And he says, as is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. See, this is our sin. We set ourselves up as the spiritual experts. And the Jews had done that, and the audience to who Paul was writing, he's writing to Gentiles too, and so they had done it in a little bit different way, and I'm sure they're Paul is still pointing towards them. He's just coming around the backside to get them. But we can't make ourselves right before God, and it's fascinating that the things Paul points out are some of the same things that Jesus pointed out to the Pharisees when he walked the earth. He called them whitewashed tombs. In other words, he said, you look great on the outside, but on the inside there's horrible, horrible things. He said to them that they had turned the temple, the worship of God, a place of prayer, into a den of robbers because they were trying to line their pocketbooks with it. He said, you talk about the law, and yet you come up with little ways to get around the law. One of the ways they did that was they said it's called korban, they said, I don't have to tithe or I don't have to give if I don't have to help my parents, and I don't have to take care of my family if I declare everything I have belongs to the temple. Now, they didn't give everything to the temple. It was just a declaration that it belonged to the temple. Therefore, they're not responsible to take care of their family anymore. It's what you might call a spiritual trust. You know, we have trust accounts today where you would, I don't know if you're familiar with that kind of financial planning, but basically a trust is you put all of your money and all your assets into a trust that is managed. Now, you get to manage it, but it sort of doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the trust from a legal point of view. It's not yours. It belongs to the trust, and some of them are set up where you can't even change it. You can manage it, but you can't change it, that kind of stuff. That's sort of what korban is. We're putting everything in a spiritual trust, therefore it can't be used to take care of our family, but I still get to use it for myself, see? So they were liars and they were stealers. And yet they stood up and they preached and they talked and they wore their robes and they wanted people to look at them. And they were spiritually prideful. So when we think we can make ourselves right with God, we set ourselves up as spiritual experts. Then in verse 24, he talks about God's name being blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. I think this is one of the things that hurts the most. And because I'm a pastor, my friends talk to me. And I know all of us have off days. I know all of us struggle sometimes. And I know people are tempted to take one incident and make a whole lifetime of rebellion against God out of it. But it is sad to me that sometimes we are our own worst enemies. Let me back up just a little bit. This is what happened with the children of Israel. Remember, God would ask them to worship Him alone, to honor Him alone. And they decided they were going to honor gods that they thought would bring benefit to them. And they did horrible things trying to appease the gods, thinking it was going to be a benefit to them. See, that's self-centered religion. And God warned them through the prophets over and over again. They ended up killing many of the prophets or beating the prophets. They would not listen to the word of God through the prophets. And so then God had to punish them, and God brought punishment from other nations. And He literally punished the children of Israel several times and took them out into exile. Well, this is what happened. Because the children of Israel would not follow God, would not obey His laws, would not do what was right in His eyes, did not have pure hearts before Him, they ended up being captured into exile. When they were taken into exile, the other nations would look at them and laugh, and they would say, ha, 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 their God really isn't very powerful. Ha, 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 their God really doesn't care about them. And so God ended up being blasphemed because the children of Israel wouldn't follow Him with their whole heart. It still happens today. It still happens. When I talk with people, they talk about the times that they engage us and how our attitude sometimes can stink. Can stink. How we can be arrogant. How we can be self-centered. How we're not very kind, not very loving sometimes. And it seems especially when something bad happens. You know, when there's an accident, or when something happens in our neighborhood, or when something happens, at work or whatever, and we feel like we're getting the short end of the stick, instead of being forgiving and kind, we can be arrogant, hard-hearted. And to be honest with you, I'm not going to share any stories with you this morning, because some of my friends watch television and may watch our program, and I don't want them to think I'm using their story. But there are real stories of real people who've brushed up against the church, and they found nothing but arrogance and meanness. So what happened to just the simple, loving, kind heart of a believer? When we think we got it all right and we can make our own selves right with God, then we set ourselves up to be spiritually arrogant. And what happens is people turn away from God because of us. People won't have anything to do with His church because of us. And it has to do with how we treat our waiter or our waitress. It has to do with how we treat the clerk at the store. Let me ask you to do something. Next time you go to the store, get the eyes of whoever's waiting on you at the cash register. Get their eyes. You'll discover something it's hard to do, because usually they don't look at people. They don't. But I've discovered one way to get their eyes. The Lord has blessed us with this neat little tool to help us. It's called a name tag. And usually it's right there on them. And so why not, next time you go to the store, wherever, what store do you go to? Ingles. Next time, I thought somebody was going to say Walmart. Bob Engel would be proud if he were here with us this morning. Next time you're at Ingles and you walk up to the cash register, say, "Hey, James, how are you today?" They'll look at you. They will. And usually they don't know what to say for a few minutes. And then just engage them in conversation as a human being. Because this is what they usually get, sometimes, honestly, even from us. Wait a minute, would you check the price of that? I don't think that's right. It's not his fault that the price is not right. Just be nice about it. And discover something. People are longing to be related to and to be treated kindly. And if anywhere or from anyone they should be treated kindly, it should be from us. And when we don't, God is blasphemed, because they know us. They know us. And they watch. They watch. There was a preacher, I think his last name was Parker. This is a long time ago, back when the buses were brand new, and he had been preaching a revival service in London. And he got onto the bus and gave his money, and the guy gave him change, and he went back and sat down in his seat. And he normally would have just stuck the change in his pocket. For some reason, he looked at it, and he discovered that the bus driver had given him back too much change. And it was just a few cents, and he thought for a minute, oh, no big deal. But then he thought, no, you know what? Honesty's honesty. So as he got off the bus, he said to the driver, "You gave me 2 cents too much in change." And the driver stopped and said, "You probably don't recognize me, but I was at your worship service last night. And I intentionally gave you too much change to see if you were honest like you preach for us to be." People are watching. They're watching. Then he starts talking about circumcision. There's another little story I forgot to tell you earlier about 3 religious leaders, a Jew, Catholic, priest, and a Baptist. They got into a discussion about who could convert a bear. And so they got back together a couple weeks later, and there was a Methodist minister. And his arm was in a bandage. They said, "Oh, what happened?" He said, "Wow, it's hard to get close enough to a bear to sprinkle him." Sitting beside him was the Baptist. He had crutches and a broken leg. He said, "Sprinkle him. You should try to baptize one of those guys in a bodysuit." in bed was the Jewish priest who said, baptize him. Have you ever tried to circumcise a bear, he said. This is sort of a funny word, and it's funny that we talk about it in church. But Paul starts talking about circumcision because this was the outward visible sign that Jews depended on. Now, people didn't see it necessarily, but they knew who was circumcised and who wasn't, because this was a ritual that they went through 7 or 8 days after they were born. It had religious significance to it. God had asked them to be circumcised as an outward symbol. And so he talks about circumcision having value only if you observe the law. Paul's saying, hey, this outward symbol is meant to be evidence of an inward event. And so the next truth has to do with the sign of salvation is a surrendered heart. Now, Paul nuances this little argument. It sort of goes like this. He says, you might be circumcised on the outside, but if you don't follow the law, you're as good as being uncircumcised. And someone who is not circumcised on the outside, who follows the law, is better than you. They're acting like a circumcised person. Let's put it in our language today. Those of us who claim the name of Christ, who say we are Christian, who wear crosses around our neck and have fish symbols on the back of our car, if we have those symbols outwardly and yet live like the rest of the world or do not live according to the teaching of God, then we're as good as people we're worse than people who don't have those things. And there are people out there who make no claims to follow Christ, no claims to be a Christian. When they act with respect according to the law and live a moral life, they condemn us. They don't even claim to follow Christ, and yet they have a moral center that's stronger than our moral center. And Paul was saying, you guys got it all mixed up. It's not the cross that you wear around your neck or the flag, the Christian flag that's flying in your yard that makes a difference. The sign of salvation is a surrendered heart. What is our sin? Well, we focus on the external. And Paul brings it all to a close when he talks there in verse 29. He says that a Jew, now remember he's defined Jew as one who's right before God. The person who's right before God is right before God because of what happens in his heart. And circumcision was a sign of surrender. It was a sign of cutting off that which is fleshly so that you have a tender heart towards God. In the Bible, it talks about having circumcised hearts. In other words, not being focused on ourselves. Just this past weekend, the leaders of the church, the elders, and Johnny and I, we met because we love you and we care about you, and we want so desperately for us to be a vibrant community of faith. But and this is something that's been Johnny and I have been talking about for several months, what is it that makes us a vibrant community of faith? We discovered it's not a certain kind of music, and it's not a certain kind of dress, it's not a certain kind of building, it's not certain kinds of people. But in order to have the right kind of actions in a vibrant community of faith, we must have Christ-like attitudes. It begins in our heart. And so we were looking into Scripture this past Friday, asking ourselves the question, what attitudes or what ways of thinking does Jesus ask us to have? And nowhere in the Bible does Jesus say to us, you take care of yourself and be self-centered. Nowhere. But he does ask us to lay down our lives, to lay down our hearts, and not focus on the external life, focus on the internal life. And make sure that our attitude is an attitude of humility. Make sure that our way of thinking is the way of love and compassion. Make sure that our thoughts revolve around the thoughts of Scripture and truth. Make sure that we are grateful. Boy, I tell you what, when we stop and consider all that God has done for us, we should be nothing but grateful.